recording. Okay. So we are very lucky today. We have Nora Lustig, who is the Samuel Z. Stone Professor of Latin American Economics and Director of the Commitment to Equity Institute at Tulane University. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, the Center for Global Development, and the Inter-American Dialogue. Professor Lustig's research is on economic development, inequality, and social policies with emphasis on Latin America. I thought that this would be a great introduction to the beginning of the 2021 Morris Bart Lecture Series. This is certainly an incredibly relevant topic that we have been seeing on the front lines of the news for quite some time now. So I'm very excited to have Professor Lustig here to talk with us. If you need any clarification while she's speaking, you can raise your hand or ask for clarification. Otherwise, she's happy to take questions at the end of the presentation. So thank you for joining us, Professor Lustig.
Yes, let me start by saying hello to everyone, and thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Jillian, for arranging this. It's a pleasure to be part of this lecture series in the NOJCC. And I am going to be talking about, first of all, tell you a little bit about what happened to inequality in Latin America. Many of you know that it is the most unequal region of the world, but we had good news for a period of time that unfortunately did not continue. And then focus on what the COVID-19 may mean for Latin American inequality, poverty, and social mobility in the future, because it is one of the regions that has been hit the hardest, really. And I think that what I'm going to be using a couple of technical terms. So please, if you don't understand them, interrupt me, because this may be distracting as I show data if the coefficient that I'm going to be using is not understood. But I always say it's better to ask. I don't know, somebody told me that there's a Chinese proverb that if you ask a question, you may seem stupid for 5 minutes, but if you don't, you'll be ignorant for the rest of your life. And that's what I tell my students, and I tell all my audiences, and I apply it myself. So let me start by sharing some information and graphs here about what happened to inequality in Latin America. And I'm going to be using something that we economists call the Genie Coefficient. Has anybody heard? Well, I'm sure Eduardo has, but you're not allowed, and probably Rebecca. But I don't know if the rest is familiar with it, but I think what you need to know, this is a number that measures inequality, is a summary that measures what happens in the entire distribution. And I guess, the only important thing to know when we look at it as sort of at this point in terms of broad trends is that the closer it is to unity, the more inequality. The closer it is to zero, the less inequality. So when the Gini coefficient goes down, that's good news. When it goes up, it's bad news from the inequality point of view. So one thing that has happened in Latin America is that when you look at the period of, it's almost 30 years now, but the data that we have for all the countries doesn't go beyond 2017, in some cases a little even earlier, or in some cases after, but roughly that's the period we're looking at. An unusual thing that happened is that inequality for that entire period seems to have declined. And this may be a surprise to many of you that are hearing in the news all the time about inequality rising, always inequality is high, inequality is rising. Part of that is because inequality has been rising in the US. And what happens in the US influences what people talk about very forcefully. But in Latin America, the trend was different than in the US, and very, if you want, surprising, given that it was happening in a region that was characterized not only by high inequality, but by persistently high inequality. Because that never happened.
Yeah, I understand.
Excuse me? No. All right. So, but this trend over the period was not uniform. You had a period in which inequality increased, another one in which it declined, and it declined practically in every country between 2002 and 2013. This coincided with the period in which there was high growth in the southern part of the Latin American region, but inequality declined also in countries in which growth was not high, like Mexico and Central America, which were not experiencing the commodity boom as much as, as Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Brazil, etc., also experienced a decline in inequality. Since 2013, this trend has not continued. And what you have now is situations in which either inequality, if it falls by very little, or it stays unchanged. And in some countries, we began to see reversals, and inequality is again in the rise. And I'm talking before COVID here. Okay, this is all COVID, pre-COVID-19 trends. Where it rose before COVID-19, for example, is Brazil. We're also seeing some evidence of that in Argentina. And Brazil is one of the most unequal countries, not only in Latin America, but also in the world. So whenever inequality rises, then that's problematic. I should add, and I'll show you now in a moment a graph with that even though inequality has declined in Latin America, it's still the region that has the highest average inequality. So here I show you bars that feature the Gini coefficient. Remember that the higher it is, the more unequal, the lower, the less unequal, for the big regions in the world, using the way that the World Bank classifies countries into regions. And here the blue bar corresponds to circa 1990. The first gray corresponds to around 2000, the green to 2010, and the second darker gray, I think it is, around 2018. And as you can see, Latin America featured an increase in inequality in the 1990s, and then it's been steadily falling. And this is unusual. You see something happen in Europe, but between what it was at 2000 and 2018, a little bit in the Middle East, although the Middle East has to be taken with caution because it covers very few countries, the data. And as I was explaining, in North America is where you saw an increase, and then North America is primarily driven by what's happening in the US, and that's why people are very focused on the decline, on the rising inequality as what you hear out there in the media. But this phenomenon, and let me see if I can use the pointer, just a laser pointer. Yeah, this phenomenon is quite striking and unusual. And therefore, people have been trying to understand what was behind it, because we may learn things in terms of policy options looking into the future, see whether you can actually have inequality fall, not only in Latin America, but in other parts of the world. Are there broader lessons? And here's the entire region. And, we have the Gini coefficient. Again, the more you move towards zero, the better, in the sense it's less inequality. The more you move towards one, higher inequality. This is around the starting point of the period that I'm looking at, and this is the end. If there had been no change in inequality, all the dots would have been coinciding with the diagonal. They all would have been exactly the same in the early 1990s, and at the end of the period in which I'm studying. That would have meant that we would have observed all the points that are in orange now lying on the diagonal. The fact that most of them are below the diagonal is telling me that inequality in practically every country was lower in 2017 than in 1992, because they're all below the diagonal, with the exception of Costa Rica, by the way, was one country that this didn't happen, even though in the 2000s it did experience a decline, but it was not sufficient to compensate the larger increase in other periods. But this is, what's happened in all the countries. And then people want to say, okay, so what's behind this? I mean, this is quite an interesting phenomenon. And the way we economists or at least the economists that work on inequality focus on trying to understand what the determinants are, is by techniques of what we call decomposition, to see which, first of all, income sources are the ones that are behind the decline. You can say, people have labor income, then they have income from capital like interest, rents, etc. They may have remittances from abroad and from domestic sources, and they may also have public transfers. For example, in the US, those who receive the food stamps and other benefits, those would be public transfers that form part of your income. And we want to know, in the context of Latin America, which factors contributed to this phenomenon, which I say is very unusual, and we wanted to understand more closely. So here's a pie that shows the contributions to the change from each income source. How do I look at this pie? What is this pie telling me? If we look at the biggest portion of the pie, the light blue, which is 62%, what it's telling me is that the decline in the distribution of wages, labor income, explains in an accounting framework, this is not a causal framework, it's an explanation of how the contribution of changes in labor income contributed to the overall decline in inequality, explains 62%, close to 2/3. So what happened to labor income is fundamental to understand what's behind the inequality trends in Latin America in the period in which inequality declined. The second most important one is the orange one. 17% of what happened to public transfers. So this is social assistance from the government during this period contributed to about 17% of the decline. 15%, the gray, are other income sources, which are primarily remittances. These have been important, especially in countries in Central America, where remittances are a large portion of what's happening in people's incomes. And then we have pensions and capital income. They were all equalizing in this period. And this is, to some extent surprising, but this is an average. We have then different stories per country, but overall, the average tells you an important story, because I mentioned earlier that inequality declined in countries that were growing and countries that were experiencing low growth. It also happened in countries that were exporting raw materials and countries that were net importers of raw materials. It happened in countries that were governed by the left or by regimes that were not leftist. So it was a phenomenon that was common to different characteristics of the countries in the region. And then one wants to know what was the common factor that happened during this period. And it's important to emphasize this common factor because it's the one that's endangered now with COVID. The common factor was, in the 90s, there was a large expansion in access to education. And as people's years of schooling increased, what happens is that people with low skills become relatively more scarce in the economy, and people with more skills become more abundant. The market works, and then the relative wage of people with higher skills, relative, it's always higher, but relative to people with lower skills, that gap, the wage gap, declined. So education was a very important part of the story of why inequality declined in Latin America. And it is a nice story because it's something we can do something about it. You can continue expanding education. The problem is that, one, the access to quality education has become problematic because, as we know, even though the quantity becomes more equalized, the more we try to get people to go to higher levels, we discover the heterogeneity in the quality of education, and that is one of the barriers moving forward. This would have happened without COVID. So the process to sort of improve inequality statistics, inequality trends through education probably would have had to do a lot with trying to equalize also access to education in terms of quality, not just quantity. So bottom line, inequality declined in the period, and the common factor, as I said, is the fact that the access to education became more equal and wages declined. For the, relatively speaking, the wage gap declined for those with higher skills, with lower skills. Another things that happened during the period is that many countries introduced cash transfer programs of quite a large magnitude. One that always stands out is Bolsa Familia in Brazil, which was launched in the late 1990s, and it covered about 50 million people, so a large program. And another one that also stood out, now it's no longer in place, but was Progresa in Mexico, that then changed names, but more or less benefited about 20 million people. Those were large in terms of scale, and they also increased people's income between 10 and 20%. I'm talking about the poor. These were programs targeted to the poor, but pretty much every country in the region introduced cash transfers or one sort or another, not of the same scale as in these two countries, but they became quite pervasive in the region. So this change in social policy that happened also was an important contributor to the decline in inequality, and it's reflected in this 17%. Okay, so one more thing I wanted to say is that interestingly, was there difference? I mean, we call it, was there something that the leftist governments did differently? And we did find that the left was able to produce a faster decline in inequality. The blue line here is the average for all countries. All countries experienced a decline. The orange is countries that were governed by the left, and this is a non-left. So there was something that the leftist regimes did, not necessarily means that it was good, but it was something. When I say not necessarily was good, because we don't know how sustainable some of these things were. In some countries, we know they're not sustainable, but the leftist governments, which were at some point 10 of the 17 countries were governed by a leftist regime, did something different. And in particular, what we found is that they did something different with minimum wages. The red line here is the increase in minimum wages by countries governed by the left. This is the average for the region. This is non-left. So you can see that they implemented a more generous, if you want, minimum wage policy by leftist regimes. And that was a reinforcing factor in explaining why inequality declined during the period of analysis, which is more or less the last 30 years. Okay. So this is a situation that we face once we get COVID, with the aggravating factor that this trend in declining inequality, as I said earlier, petered out. So the process did not continue. Here you can see it, how it sort of begins to peter out after 2012. The curve flattens. And in some countries, they were facing recession, so poverty was rising, inequality was rising. This is the case of Argentina, Brazil. So things started to go awry even before COVID-19. But COVID-19 hits Latin America, and it hits it really, really hard. 8% of the population, roughly, is the portion of Latin Americans in the world population, but it has close to 30% of all cases and 35% of all deaths. So epidemiologically, Latin America has been hit very hard. The countries that we've been studying the most, the biggest countries in Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, are among the top 10, but there are others that are among the top 10 in terms of death, even sometimes death per capita. In terms of the economic shock, it's also very, very large for Latin America. Just to put these numbers in context, the IMF predicts that Latin America will experience a contraction in output of around 8% in 2020. And Argentina about 12%, Brazil about 6%, Colombia 8%, and Mexico about 9%. To put it in context, for the global economy, the prediction is about 4.5%, the decline. So Latin America is above what's happening globally. And for the US, the predictions that I've seen are below 4%. So Latin America is doing worse. It's doing worse than Africa, and it's doing worse than Asia for sure. So it is among the worst places in terms of how it's been hit, both epidemiological and the economic fallout. And in addition, it's also been hit very hard in terms of the number of children that have been out of school, because as many other regions of the world, Latin America has implemented school closures as a way to deal with the pandemic. About 95% of the children and youth in Latin America have been affected by school closures throughout the region. Okay, so what's been the impact in terms of, first of all, in the short term of this contraction of output, and the situation that the contraction of output doesn't affect everybody the same. It affects people that are in non-essential sectors more forcefully. And so we don't have hard data yet to actually look at what's been happening with precision. We do have polls that people have been doing by telephone because they're not able to do surveys in person. So we have polls and surveys that have been collected by telephone or online. But what we did with my co-authors, some of them are at Tulane, others are in other parts of the region, we've been using simulations to try to sort of identify what have been the impacts of this phenomenon on the short-term effects in terms of inequality and poverty. And we've looked at two things. We looked at inequality before the pandemic, let's say at the end of 2019, then look at what would be the effect in the absence of compensating policies in the social assistance I mentioned that try to mitigate the effect of this. And then we looked at what have these policies done in order to mitigate the effect. And I'm going to show you a couple of slides that synthesize what we found. And again, we're doing this for the countries that are the largest in the region: Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico. We now have some studies also that are looking at Central American countries, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, but I have not been processed yet. And what, I'm showing you here the impact on the Gini coefficient. Again, remember that the closer it is to 0, the more equal; the closer it is to 1, the more unequal. So when it goes up, it's bad. When it goes down, it's good from the inequality point of view. And let me show you what happened, with our analysis with Argentina. This is the Gini coefficient, 0.444 before the COVID-19. Then we shock the system, if you want, with our simulations. And this is what would have happened without any social assistance, the Gini coefficient. This increase of the Gini coefficient is a lot, by the way. The Gini coefficient moves in the third decimal, if it moves at all. So the fact that it could have moved by 2 or more points, it's significant. And this is what happens if you simulate also the policies that involved social assistance to those who were affected by the COVID-19. In the case of Brazil, interestingly, the social assistance at some point was so generous that people, and we estimated, and other people have estimated, that even inequality could have fallen compared to the pre-COVID. In the case of Colombia, they did some social assistance, but little. So the effect, the mitigating effect, is very small compared to Argentina and to Brazil. And in Mexico, they didn't introduce any social assistance policies to mitigate the effect. Mexico decided to rely on previous systems, and it did extend more credits to some of the enterprises, which was done also in Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia, but no rise in social assistance. In contrast, Brazil and Argentina introduced huge programs. And one interesting thing is that they were able to reach people that everybody thought when the pandemic started, they were not reachable, which are those who are in the informal sector. As you know, Latin America is characterized by lots of people who are not in the formal sector. not this doesn't happen in the US. People have access to unemployment insurance one way or the other. That's because everybody pretty much is in the formal sector. That doesn't exist in Latin America. So there was a concern that those who were not eligible for unemployment insurance, which is a very small portion of the labor force in Latin America, and were not in the administrative rosters of the social assistance program that preceded COVID, would not be able to receive any help. Well, we showed that they could receive help, and this is a lesson that I think we need to find out more about why it worked. That Brazil was able to introduce a program that reached about 50 million beneficiaries in about 3 weeks, and Argentina about 9 million beneficiaries with mistakes, but they were able to roll them out very quickly. And they had an impact both on inequality and also on poverty. I mean, for example, this is, this is another indicator that we use. This is a head count ratio, which is probably more commonly known by everybody than the Gini coefficient, which is something that only people who work on these things hear about. The head count ratio is just the share of the poor divided by the total population. So you can measure poverty with the poverty line that the countries use. For example, in the US, the poverty line is about $13 a day. In Latin America, it can go from 5, 6, 7. And this is the international poverty line that the World Bank uses for some of the middle income countries. And as you can see, in the countries that introduce large social assistance, the impact on the number of poor has been mitigated quite a bit by the social assistance. Otherwise, you would have had a sharp increase in poverty as well. Mexico, which did not introduce these policies, is the country that's going to show the largest increase in the absolute number of poor people, with the international poverty line is close in our, again, estimates about 9 million. I've checked that against some of the actual data Mexico has been releasing, and it's pretty much similar to what's being predicted by the statistical offices in Mexico. Okay, so now this is the short-term effects. And the impact is large, but countries that have introduced policies have been able to mitigate them, at least temporarily mitigate them. But the issue is, even if you had this short-term effect that may be reversible, our concern is with the non-reversible impacts. As economies recover, then incomes will go to some extent to what they used to be, maybe not exactly. But the problem is that for the poor, the short-term shocks can become into long-term effects through particularly what happens to education and health of children of the poor. And the school closures can affect poor children disproportionately, which in the longer run can really lead to lower intergenerational mobility, to future higher inequality of opportunity, and future higher wage inequality, because in a way, what may happen to education now could be a reverse story of what I explained earlier was a good part in terms of what happened to inequality when inequality was falling. Remember that access to education was one of the factors, and especially access to education by those who were at the lower end of the education spectrum. So what can we expect from this? What we can expect from this, we've been doing some calculations. Again, you have to do this with simulations. You don't have hard data yet, with information about how, the evolution of high school completion may happen to children who are now in the last year of high school. And what we find is that the effect could be quite significant, especially for children of disadvantaged households. By disadvantaged households, we mean households with lower levels of education, which is correlated with households with lower levels of connectivity and a much lower ability to replace schooling in the formal context by homeschooling. It's very different for a parent that has no education. will not have the ability to actually mentor a coach or pay for a tutor to replace formal schooling in a way that doesn't have an impact on what may happen. So as you can see here, the cohort that was born in the period in which now they would be in higher education, you know, I have you guys in front of my, I'm gonna have to, I don't know how to do this because I'm trying to get you, you're my way, but you can see the end of the graph, right? I can't. The end of the graph shows you the black would have been the trend under no COVID-19. The red is what may COVID-19 imply, which means that the probability of completing high school, secondary school, for the children of disadvantaged households could fall about 20 percentage points as a result of COVID-19, okay? So this is quite distressful because it means that you are, like I say, seeding, you're sowing the inequality of the future as a result of this trend, unless you do something to remediate it. And let me show you also that what happens when you look at the 4 countries that I was showing you also the short-term impacts. The reds are the children in low education households. The blues are in high education households. The solid blocks are the pre-pandemic. And then you have the white with the white blocks with the red or the blue borders are what would have happened without mitigation policies. And the solid in light color is what the mitigation policies are doing. But I want you to focus on the following. Let's take Brazil. This is Brazil. This is the probability of completing high school before the pandemic. This is for low parental education households. This is what happens, what's expected to happen after COVID for children in low parental households. This is what happens to children in high parental households, almost nothing. So the gap between the ability to complete high school between the low parental households and the high parental households in the post-COVID world looks awful. It looks awful for Mexico. It looks awful also for Colombia, a little less for Argentina, which is got a more, if you can develop education system in terms of coverage. So what this is telling us is that the inequality of education will rise. And again, like I said, this will also imply that intergenerational mobility will fall. Now, is this a sort of a lost cause? And we argue in the work that we've been doing that it's not, but it will require a tremendous effort during the this year in particular, not just, you know, it's not reopening schools. Even if we reopen schools, this is not going to make up for the lost time. It will require targeted actions on the low education children, the vulnerable children, to actually bring them up to speed. And this will require also resources, financial resources. Now, the countries, most of them during this period have increased their fiscal deficit because they have expanded spending, in particular to help people who were unemployed and also firms. So they raised their fiscal deficits quite a bit. That in the coming years will have to be reined in. When they do that, one thing that we're advocating is and advising is do not reduce spending on education. Probably you will have to increase spending on education because in order to put in place all the remedial actions, if you want the fallout to occur, the one that I showed you earlier in the graph with the red line and the black line, then you probably will need more resources. We also say that probably this is going to have to be done not just by the government because the problem is so daunting that it will require actions also on the part of private firms and the community organizations to actually help children of the vulnerable groups make up for the what they lost during this period. Again, if this isn't done, then this may be the most lasting scar for Latin America, and with consequences that will be with us for a long, long time. So let me finish here, and I'd be happy to take questions. In fact, I don't know how long I spoke. Okay, we're fine. I spoke as much as I was supposed to.
Perfect. Does anyone have questions or want clarification on some of this? It's a lot of information.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know if.
Oh, no, that's fine.
It's great. There. Well, one question I have several questions. I don't know if I can formulate them, but one is about Costa Rica and it being out of the mix on all of this. What do you suppose that is about? Is it because they're tied more to external sources for income?
I have to admit ignorance in this. I am not a person who is an expert on it. And in fact, Central America is understudied in terms of what the inequality dynamics are in general. So you will need to ask Ludovico. But I've been trying to prod people to study what the trends are in Latin America, in Central America, because like I said, on the other hand, you have Costa Rica as a weird case because it's a country that people used to say, oh, I mean, this is a country that's recognized as an equitable country. It had a social welfare state. So something must have happened in wage inequality that we need to understand. But then on the other side, you have El Salvador, which showed a very sharp decline in inequality, and it's also not clearly explained by why.
Mm-hmm.
By what factors.
It's curious that it's 8% in Latin America and 4% more or less in Africa. I mean, you said
4.5 is about in the rest of the world. Africa, I think, I don't have the data in front of me, but I think it was between 3 and 4%. And some countries, it's in Asia, for example, some countries are going to grow. So yeah, Latin America has been clobbered by COVID in economic terms.
How much of this disparity between the well-to-do and the poor has to do with access to computer equipment and Wi-Fi?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And in fact, I was going to show you, let me end the show, because that is one of the things that's driving the fact that you have inequality in terms of access to be able to. I was looking for some data that I had. If you hang on for a moment, yeah. We have, data in terms of internet coverage for households whose head has less than secondary school in Bolivia, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua is 30%, while it is above 90% in families within the same country, headed by adults with more than secondary education. So you have a huge gap to start with in terms of being able to access education online. But that's not the end of the story. Even if you equalize that, you would have the tremendous inequality in having a parent who has university degrees versus those who may have not even completed primary schooling. So that's something you cannot fix with connectivity. But connectivity definitely, I mean, one of the things that came out, I remember, in March, I think March, we had a group of people that we were talking to the president of the Inter-American Development Bank at the time. And I have to say that, I think it was March. And when, he was asking, so what is it that we should focus on? I said connectivity. At that time, people had not realized how important that could be. Because I remember they looked at me and said, why connectivity? Now everybody's speaking of that. But when we worked on this issue, we realized immediately that connectivity was a big divide in terms of being able to do not just schooling, but working. Lots of people cannot work from home if they don't have connectivity, even if their type of job would allow it to do it.
Connectivity now means interaction, as opposed to initially, I think with satellite and television, it was one way. It was entertainment, and now it's education.
Right.
The opportunity is there if curiosity exists.
Yeah. So, however, you know, by the way, I just wanted to you were surprised by why Latin America was doing so much worse than Africa. One of the reasons people are, you know, this is still going to be studied a lot, but one of the reasons people are conjecturing as to behind this is the fact that Africa is much more rural. And this is a disease that affected the urban areas much more. The economies are much more urbanized. So that's one of the, I mean, agriculture has been relatively protected everywhere in Latin America too. So that is probably one of the reasons why Latin America is worse off, because it's mainly a region of middle income countries, which did not implement policies, draconian policies like China did, which is also a middle income country, but it was able to sort of navigate the economic downturn and even the epidemiological one in a way that is remarkable. But interesting that you mentioned this about connectivity. Actually, I'm not an expert on this, but Mexico uses the old-fashioned way of teaching, which was through not having to have internet, what do you call it? You needed to have electricity, because the only thing you had to be able to do is have access to online, to classes that were videotaped or transmitted through TV. And Mexico has been implementing this for a long, long time, because Mexico has a large rural population for the type of country it is, and in very dispersed communities. So in some cases, they could not use, they could not bring schools to the communities. So telesecundaria was pretty common in Mexico before COVID. And so apparently it's one of the countries that's been able to do it better than others, precisely because of the experience. So it seems to have an impact. It doesn't need to be two ways sometimes. You can use also old-fashioned instruments. They're not going to work perfectly, but they seem to work okay in some contexts.
Well, one other comment comparing Latin America to Africa is the fact that during the past 15 years, Africa has experienced severe SARS outbreaks. And the countries there are used to doing it, such that the incidence of COVID disease in Africa is probably only 10 to 15% the incidence in Latin America, and far less than the United States. So there's much less COVID impact in Africa because of this prior experience. And the fact that even without developed medical and public health systems, they have ways of managing these communicable diseases that we don't have in the United States and Latin America does not have.
Absolutely. I mean, when at the beginning of the pandemic, we were asked to do, because although my focus is on Latin America, my institute became global. And so we were doing some work on Uganda. And, we're in touch with people in Uganda, in Kampala all the time. And I was sort of surprised by the tiny number of infections and death they were exposed to. And what they told us is precisely that the previous experience was very important in preparing them on how to deal and cope with the COVID-19 epidemic in a way that Latin America was not prepared. Lots to learn. I mean, Africa actually is going to be able to teach, I think, other parts of the world lots of things, because it was able to do it with little resources.
Hello, can I ask a question? Oh, you can't hear me. Yeah, you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So, let me see if I understand this. Latin America, I'm going to summarize a little bit. Latin America has had a, so we say, regressionary blip in its inequality, favorable inequality trend. It was flattening out. Now it's lowered a little bit more, but because of mitigation policies on the on the income side, it's not as bad as it could have been. And so from there, we go to two possible scenarios. One would be if Latin America continues with the kinds of income policies and transfer policies that it had prior to COVID, that there could be a substantial recovery of losses in inequality again, so another upward trend. It wouldn't be as favorable because of this long-term educational problem. How bad is bad and how potentially good is good in terms of the situation between 2002 and 2013?
Okay, so I think a lot depends on what's going to happen to output, and output will be affected by the ability to sort of curb the illness during this period, and we have new uncertainties, right? But even before that, the issue is that the transfer programs that were so generous are not sustainable fiscally, okay? So I think that as we update our simulations, maybe with also what may be happening this year as a result of the new virus, which I hope the recurve, I was going to ask if the vaccines are going to take care of them too. But there's concern that you may not be able to actually curb the pandemic as much as you thought you could with the vaccine, with the new types of viruses, right? Of the mutations. So the transfers cannot be sustained even in the absence of worse situations. So if the recovery is not really significant, then inequality and poverty will be hit hard. In addition, the countries will not be able to sustain the fiscal situation, not only because of transfers, but they're going to have to at some point start repaying the indebtedness that they have increased during this period, which means that the revenues have to come from somewhere. And we need to look at what the impact of those revenue raising measures might be. If it's taxes, then who will pay for them? And it's something that we plan to simulate as well. What will be the impact once you take into account how you pay for all this? The situation may not be that fantastic, but definitely it may be less dramatic than if you hadn't had these cushioning. Because even if it was a short-term cushioning, during that period, people were not as worse off as they could have been. And that's very important. It also may have had impact on longer-term effects. For the poor, if you have an income floor, it also protects nutrition for the children. So you have the longer-term impacts may have also been mitigated by some of this. And again, that's why we emphasize education, because education could not be, in this case, supported through income transfers because schools were closed. So that is not a policy that would have worked. And transfers are not enough to, hire tutors. So that's why we have emphasized so much education.
And that's a short follow-up question related to education.
Mm-hmm.
So how long in terms of time is such an educational gap? So, for example, you mentioned that that increases in, shall we say, high school completion lowered the income gap between more skilled and less skilled. Did that take place over those 10 years in which we saw favorable trends? Does it take 10 years to do that?
I'm going to give you a guesstimate here, or a guess answer, because it's something that it's not been quantified precisely. But one thing that we know is that in the Latin America was increasing the average years of schooling in the 70s by about 2 years. And in the 1980s, as a result of the debt crisis, that fell to 1 year. And what happened in the 1980s probably explains also the rising inequality in the 1990s, because you slow down this equalization, this equalizing force through education because of its impact on the wage gap, okay?
Mhm.
In the 90s, the reverse occurred. So I would say is that, yes, it is in that decade probably where you saw the switch back to something in which the wage gap could be lowered as a result of the composition of education by skill. But what I want to do now with my co-authors and we're is to quantify this also into the future. I mean, for example, this could be a blip if it only affects a very small portion, you know, those who are about to finish high school, and then, you know, it's going to affect them. They're going to be hurt. And we know that people who are exposed to these shocks suffer through their lifetime. There's studies that looked at the US pandemic of 1918 and how it affected those who were even in utero during this period. But it may only affect them. On the other hand, it may affect not just people who are in the margin or in high school. It may affect everybody. It may be people who start dropping out from other years of schooling because they're not going to go back after they missed this year. So you may have a pervasive impact, which would be the one that could be the most damaging. What we plan to do is do what you are asking, but looking forward rather than, we could do it also looking backward and see what the movie would look like under different assumptions and what will mean for social mobility, inequality of opportunity, and inequality itself into the future. So we're working now on thinking about an analytical framework that will allow us to do that, and hopefully we'll have an answer. You like that? Yeah, I want to do that. I've been meaning to do that in the movie in the back. I wanted to do it for a long time, but now I found a co-author who likes to work on this. So
Good.
So I just want to talk about the vaccine and the variants. So the first question is, how accessible is the vaccine in terms of, say, Latin America versus the vaccine, in Europe and the US? Do they have, large contracts with Pfizer, with AstraZeneca? I think one of the difficulties is storage of these vaccines, where you need to have the ultra low temperatures. I don't think that's very feasible for many countries in Latin America. So I think we need to wait for potentially another type of, there are several vaccines out there, but one that could be stored in refrigerators more easily. I mean, there's Novavax, which is more like a flu vaccine protein type base. So I think one of the things we just have to wait to see, not from these first vaccines, but as these new ones come out, how accessible they are throughout Latin America. And that could then affect. The other question is the variants. I really think that, we have to think of historical aspects. When SARS, the first one, came out in 2003, that SARS, I remember being very frightened about it in Hong Kong as it was coming out. And then by some fate, it turned out to be a very deadly virus, and it killed 60% of the people who were infected. Am I right, Joel? Somewhere like that, I think, right? And so when that happened, it basically burnt itself out. And so if you have a very lethal virus, it doesn't get transmitted as much. The question is, if we get variants of COVID, will it turn out that they're going to be susceptible to the vaccine? Will they be less easily transmissible? And we just don't know. Will they be more, virulent? So these are things, but I think the key will be getting these easy to transmit vaccines to Latin America.
yeah, I am not an expert on how accessible it is right now, but I know that countries are negotiating In Argentina, they had the Russian vaccine, but nobody was big. Even the president doesn't want to. But I think now they're doing sort of negotiations with a large contractor. In fact, that's one of the things I plan to do during my class is to investigate the course I'm going to start teaching next week is to recruit my students to help me investigate what's happening on the vaccine front and also how accessible it is across socioeconomic groups as well, because there may be inequality in access in terms of who gets a vaccine once they have the vaccines being deployed.
I have been following these vaccine access issues, and the outlook for Latin America is not good. What's been happening for the Western vaccines, if you will, is that a number of the more well-to-do countries, including at this point the United States, have been putting out bids and tying up capacity way more than they need for their own populations, leaving smaller countries just sort of out in the cold and, having them turn to Russia or China to see what they can do. And right now, Russia and China don't have the ability to cover much more than their own populations. And their vaccines have been through less thorough testing. So there are questions in terms of the efficacy. I would think at the best, we would look at Latin America or most of Latin America being a full year behind in making progress on immunization compared to the United States, Canada and Europe. The outlook is not good for vaccines in the United States because of the fact that these countries have been buying up and tying up manufacturing capability.
And where do you get that? I mean, I don't know your name, by the way, because it doesn't.
I'm Joel Nitskin. I'm a semi-retired public health physician.
Okay, so can I invite you to talk to my class?
Yeah, you could.
Then, but where do you get the information about access to vaccines for Latin America?
Well, this is being tracked by the World Health Organization.
Okay.
And there's a group at Johns Hopkins University that's keeping a global track of all this, not only the distribution, but also the contracts, the manufacturing capabilities, and so on.
All right. Yeah, so I'll take a look. And also IHME is the one that I'm looking at. So, but you just said it's not encouraging then. I don't know who asked the question, but then it was answered again. But thank you. Any other question? Was it understandable for those of you who are not part of this world that I'm always curious about whether we economists can communicate stuff in a way that intelligent people that are non-economists can follow?
Yeah, quite frankly, from my perspective, I thought the impact on poor people would be substantially worse from COVID than you're projecting.
Well, we don't know yet. I mean, this is, like I said, this is the first impact. And, we had in Mexico is pretty bad, actually, but because they didn't implement the policies to mitigate it. But we have not seen the end of the story. But it is less bad than what people anticipated in countries like Brazil and Argentina,
Yeah, I was going to just echo what Jillian Richmond had earlier said about Costa Rica, because I spent a lot of time and I keep in touch with Costa Rica over those periods. The data just doesn't seem to make sense to me because, for example, I been there since about 1987 for many, many years, teaching medical students and running a research lab. And the health system is excellent for all people. Secondly, the education system is excellent for all people. And as far as I could see, the economy was a very robust economy. I mean, so I'm just not quite sure of, how it may be a technicality and how the data was counted. Yeah.
No, but I mean, you're making points, and let me have the opportunity then to explain why what you said could be consistent with rising inequality, because first of all, I mean, I'm not measuring the inequality in access to education or health. This is income inequality, right? So you could have fantastic access and everybody have access to quality education and health. That's very important. And at the same time, you could have income inequality rising. And income inequality growth is not something that will prevent inequality from rising, by the way. There's no relationship, no correlation between growth and inequality. You can have, when you look at the data over time across the world, there are as many countries in which inequality growth during growth periods and inequality declines during growth periods, because a lot depends on what happens to relative wages. It depends on what kind of growth you have. It may be a skill biased growth that demands more people with higher skills, and their wages could go up with growth. Now, poverty will decline always when you have growth, but inequality can rise. So everything that you said could still be consistent with increasing inequality.
You make a very good point, because as you were talking, something came to mind to me that I didn't really appreciate. So over the period of time that I went there, I remember the rate of inflation was incredible. So for the dollar to the colony, I mean, I can't say how many, I mean, I used to be like maybe 13 coloni. It went up to like 167 coloni to a dollar. I mean, and it kept rising. So I think that point, I didn't appreciate that. In fact, so the poorer people, they didn't have as much value in what their money was doing. So that's a very good point. Even though the whole growth was going, the income inequality was much greater.
Yeah, that's another factor. If you have high inflation, inflation tends to be regressive in the sense that it hurts the poor more. But I said, even in the absence of inflation, the pattern of growth can be such, and this is, I think, Jillian's question was asking, did something happen in terms of how Costa Rica was integrated to the global economy through the IT sector, for example, telecommunications? That is a sector that probably demands people with higher skills more than people with lower skills. And so their wages could go up at the same time that the economy grows. Even in the absence of inflation, you can have a great welfare system that serves everybody with quality education, quality health. Even without inflation, you could have a growth pattern that's unequalizing, but not poverty increasing. Poverty would have been falling still, so poverty fell. But I think that this seems that if there's a lot of people interested in Costa Rica, then Ludovico should be invited to give a talk to sort of talk about what happened there. And Eduardo, I keep saying that, I mean, maybe you find students also. I haven't found students who want to work on Central America, but maybe you're luckier in the political economy PhD that can sort of understand more the dynamics. Because I am very puzzled, like I say, by El Salvador. And I see the data and I see the Gini coefficient fell by 10 points in 10 years. 10 points is unheard of. I don't know if the data is bad. Somebody has to look at that. Or something happened that is not affecting also the political and the social dynamics, because it's a country plagued with violence, right? So things can go in different directions. I mean, this is that makes life interesting to us. Otherwise we would not have anything to study.
All right, well, I think we should wrap it up here, but I will have to be in touch with Eduardo now about coming and being a speaker. We shall continue this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nora.
Thank you very much.
That was fascinating.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye. Nice to see everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nora.
Thank you, Eduardo.